I said it the other week when we were talking about the problem in probation and the fact that probation officers have been told to cut by a third the amount of time that they are meant to be keeping tabs on those out on licence. I said it again when the barristers went on strike, a strike I wholly supported them in taking because the cuts to legal aid funding meant that these very highly qualified lawyers could just about pay for the bus home after completing hours and hours of diligent work to defend people who didn't have the money to pay for lawyers themselves. I said it again when this show brought to national attention the failings of the single justice procedure, which were handing out criminal convictions to people whose prosecution would never meet any public interest test, and when those same people weren't even having their mitigation heard, let alone that mitigation tested. I said it again when trials were being pushed back by years because the court system has become so backlogged, denying timely justice to the victims of sometimes some very serious crimes. I said it again when the schizophrenia of prison policy was on display recently, the Justice Minister saying short sentences below 12 months don't work, yet at the same time criminalising the possession of laughing gas, which could result in a short prison sentence. There are only so many times one can keep saying it. But the Conservative record on criminal justice, prisons, courts, probation has been and continues to be appalling. It has been terrible. And Rishi Sunak got it handed to him on a plate by Keir Starmer at PMQs this afternoon. In the same week that Sunak said that Labour couldn't be trusted with the nation's security, the government has had to invoke emergency measures in English prisons and release prisoners early in order to make space for more serious offenders to come in. We're told, don't worry, the offenders being released early do not pose a danger to the public. We would never have on that scheme any offender who would be released early who could pose a danger to the public. Meantime, Operation Early Dawn has been brought in London and the North East and will see defendants remain in police custody and not get transferred to magistrates' courts for bail hearings because there are no prison places for them. Court cases will therefore be delayed even further, and the ability of the police to hold people they arrest will be hit because more people will be staying for longer in police custody. All of this happening in the week that Rishi Sunak started by saying Starmer couldn't be trusted with the security of the nation. So have a listen to this exchange and then ring me. Ring me if you work anywhere in the justice system, if you are a prison officer, if you are a probation officer, if you work in the court system as a magistrate or a lawyer, about who you trust to manage your industry. The Conservative Party who have been at it for 14 years or the Labour Party who would like to be. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Again, listen to Rishi Sunak. I think he gets completely turned over here by Keir Starmer. Tell me what you think or who you think would do a better job of running the justice system of this country. In fact, even better, tell me after this latest example of not really having a Scooby-Doo what's going on, tell me why you still don't trust Labour with the security of this country, or at least you trust the Tories more than you would trust Labour. That's what Sunak started the week by wanting you to think. They couldn't be trusted on the defence of the realm because Labour hadn't committed to increasing defence spending. You can't trust Labour. The message is clear. Sunak says you cannot trust Labour with the security of the nation. And then listen to this exchange and tell me that you still believe that's the case, that that is a valid argument. Does it not make what Sunak said about Labour and security even more ludicrous when you hear this exchange? Bear in mind they are currently releasing prisoners early, telling probation officers to down tools early on monitoring offenders on licence, delaying court cases further, bunging up police custody, having already had to renationalise the botched privatisation of the probation service and been up and down on whether short prison sentences work.
Are any of the prisoners he is currently letting out early considered to be high risk?
Mr. Speaker, he just showed spectacularly why he's just not fit to lead this country into the future. This country has a proud tradition of leading the world. We led the world when it came to the Industrial Revolution. But if he was around, if he was around, he would have probably called James Watt the steam bro, Mr. Speaker. And what we're doing is preparing the country for the future. But when he talks about the prison scheme, let me be crystal clear. No one would be put on the scheme if they were deemed a threat to the public. Offenders are subject to the toughest of licensing conditions, and if those conditions are broken, they are back in prison for considerably longer. But what's his record on this? He voted against tougher sentences for violent criminals. He actually opposed new powers for the police to tackle violent crime, voted against new laws that have arrested 1,000 criminal people smugglers. The message is crystal clear. He can't be trusted to keep this country safe.
I appreciate that all this rebranding is taking all of his time, but he may want to read the recent inspection report into Lewes Prison on this topic I've asked him twice about. It documents, page 5, high-risk prisoners being released at short notice without sufficient planning. Page 46, a high-risk prisoner had his release date brought forward, despite a history of stalking, domestic abuse and a restraining order. Their words, he was a risk to children. Does the early release of stalkers, domestic abusers and those considered a risk to children sound like the work of someone who is making the country more secure?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, no one should be put on this scheme if they are a threat to the public. And let me be crystal clear, it does not apply. And let me be absolutely clear, it does not apply to anyone serving a life sentence, anyone convicted of a serious violent offence, anyone convicted of terrorism, anyone convicted of a sex offence. And crucially, in contrast to the system that Labour had put in place, Mr. Speaker, governors in the prison service have an absolute lock so that no one is put on the scheme who shouldn't be. But thankfully, Mr. Speaker, their scheme let out thousands upon thousands of violent offenders onto our streets, and even 2 terrorists. Thankfully, we've toughened up sentencing against those criminals with new legislation, but he voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm glad to hear that those on life sentences are being released early, and he may not think that releasing domestic abusers is a problem, but Labour has repeatedly called for domestic abusers to be exempt from his scheme to release prisoners early. His government has shamefully ignored those calls. So now we have the evidence that domestic abusers are being released early. The Lewes report, Prime Minister, will he finally change course and back Labour's calls?
Mr. Speaker, as I've been crystal clear, there is an absolute governor lock on people who are put on the scheme.
Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer at PMQs this afternoon. And you heard, if you were listening very, very carefully, I'm sure you'd already seen the sort of sleight of hand from Rishi Sunak in answer to Keir Starmer's questions about the report, which showed that people who were posing a risk to the public, according to His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, were being released into the public as part of this scheme. Rishi Sunak said, first of all, no one would be put on the scheme if they were deemed a threat. Then, when confronted with the fact that the Independent Reviewer of Prisons has seen and found that people who posed a risk to children who were convicted for domestic abuse were being released under the scheme, Rishi Sunak then said, and I'm quoting, no one should be put on the scheme if they were deemed a threat. Both of those things can't be true at the same time. No one will and no one should. It turns out people are. Now, as Rishi Sunak tried to say, there is a governor lock on this. Prison governors are in charge of this. That should be prison governors' responsibility. And I am all for blame being apportioned correctly. Because central government is meant to be in overall charge of this doesn't mean that central government is responsible for absolutely every single decision that is taken on any part of the public sector that it is fundamentally in charge of. Prison governors have a responsibility too, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But if you start the week saying you can't trust this guy on security, then say no one is going to be put on an early prisoner release scheme who is deemed a threat to the country, are confronted by absolute watertight evidence from the Independent Inspector of Prisons that there are quite a few people who pose quite a big risk, in some cases 2 children, who are being released on this scheme. What do you take away? They don't really know what's going on. They're not really in charge of it. The thing he said 3 seconds ago, no one would be put on the scheme if they were deemed a threat, clearly isn't true. And the Prime Minister didn't know about it. So who do you trust more on the security of you and your loved ones? The bloke who's letting out, or in charge of, let's be less hyperbolic about it, in charge of a prison system that is letting out people who are deemed to be a risk despite saying no one would be released in those circumstances, or the guy who represents a political party that in the 80s and 90s did release some quite violent offenders as part of a prisoner release scheme. The week started with Rishi Sunak trying to tell you Keir Starmer wasn't to be trusted on issues of keeping the nation safe. Fast forward a couple of days and Rishi Sunak has, as Steve suggests, just turned rules into mere guidance in 30 seconds. Rishi Sunak saying no one would be released from prison early if they posed a risk to people, to the nation, to citizens. When confronted with the evidence that people who do pose a risk to all of us are being released early from prison, Rishi Sunak said no one should be put on that scheme if they were deemed a threat. Do they know what they're doing? Do they know what's going on? In the same way that the Home Secretary on Friday came on this programme and said that it wasn't necessarily a top priority to assess how safe it was for people that they are currently attempting to find to put into an immigration detention centre to go to Rwanda, about whether or not they were safe to be out and about. So who's keeping the nation safe? Steve's in Guildford. Steve.
Yeah, afternoon, Tom. Yeah, well, I think you need to sort of refer back to when you said about the 80s and 90s when the Labour government released hundreds of thousands of people for the same reason, to free up space. Mm-hmm. And people who are on serious crimes remanded in custody in police stations. Mm-hmm. And since then, through the Labour Watch, no prisons were built and there's been no infrastructure put into actual the prison sort of system. Mm. So at the end of the day, what we're doing, this problem, it's not an occurring problem, it's been a reoccurring problem since day one, under two Labour governments and two Labour Conservative governments. And that's the bottom line. You can't complain now when the infrastructure was not put in when Mr. Blair was in power, didn't do anything about it. All he'd done was let open the doors as well.
What's fascinating about what you're saying is what I think about your concept of time. You seem to have skipped from 2010 to 2024.
Yeah, but why not skip from 89 to 2004? Because it was the same problem then under a different government with the same problems. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the records, more people were released under Blair's government mm-hmm. than's being released now.
Steve, when did Blair's government end?
Well, what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't matter what he's
I know what you're saying. What did he do? You're saying what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying.
What did he do while he was in government? He didn't build any more prisons.
But who's he? Tony Blair?
Well, the Labour, and like Starmer's Labour. So they're throwing stones now when they live in greenhouses. It just can't work. Because in the day...
you're crazy. You're crazy, man. You can't... You're genuinely saying that a Starmer government is merely a continuation of Tony Blair's government, which ended in... God, when did Tony Blair hand over to Gordon Brown? 2007?
Yeah, but...
2007.
How long was he in power for?
Blair? Long time.
Yeah.
Since 1997. 10 years.
And how many prisons did he build to alleviate the problem? None. Trust me, he built none. There was no new prisons. All he did was privatise them. And he got the first one was Wymont in Preston, which he privatised. And now it's become a privatised sort of enterprise. And now they're struggling. But they've been struggling, not since 2014. They've been struggling since the late 80s.
Well,
and end of the day,
Steve, you're right. That's just maybe.
Numerous governments have not actually put the money in to build infrastructure to actually house our criminals. And that's the problem. And so it's not a new thing. This has been going back 40 years.
I get it. I understand that there have been problems in the prison estates for a long time. Ever since there have been prisons, there have been problems in the prison estate. But can we deal with the world as it is now rather than the world as it was in 2010 when Labour left power?
And
why do you keep coming back to Blair? Why is Blair so important to you?
That's the problem. No one has worked it out.
It's not the problem, is it? What happened to the last 14 years, Steve? Where did that go?
Well, the same thing that happened in the last 14 years happened the previous 12 years. Prisoners were actually used as prods and cattle prods and put in places where there was no space for them. There was no environment they can actually sort of thrive to become better people. So the last 14 years is no different from the previous 12 years. And that's what I'm trying to say. The problem is not the government. The problem is the actual system. It needs to be really addressed properly.
But who's in charge of that system?
Well, we've had we've had Labour government 12 years and the Conservative government 14 years. Not one of them have done it. So that makes you realise that
and you think
on their list, prisons is not a priority.
But, no, I agree.
Rehabilitation is not a priority.
I agree with you. It's not a political priority. I would agree with you because there's no votes in it. In doing this stuff, that no one cares very much. Once people are locked away, that's it. But Steve, I just on the apportioning of political responsibility for this, I find it astonishing that you would, as much as you can say this has been a problem for some time, and I think you're probably right, to absolve various Conservative governments of the responsibility of trying to manage it because it was a problem during Blair's years.
No, I'm not. I'm solving no one. I'm just trying to say to you, the same problems that the government has got now were prevalent under the Blair government. And that's what I'm trying to say. The problem has been there all the time.
Right.
But no one has actually solved it. Doesn't matter what you're, red or blue. Doesn't matter. End of the day, the problem is there's not enough money being put into it to actually build more prisons, to actually
and
run
you don't think
properly.
Starmer would put that money into it because he's Labour?
Well, no. At the end of the day, we had his mentor, Mr. Blair, for 12 years, which he didn't do actually nothing about it.
Right. So you're connecting. I mean, you're connecting the two very clearly. Blair, in your view, is Starmer's mentor. I think there's a lot of disagreement between those two men. But anyway, let's continue it for argument's sake. Therefore, the same thing is going to only happen again and again and again, and a plague on all your houses, I guess.